Unit 4, Inflation. Meaning of inflation. In simple words, inflation means a continuous increase in the general price level. Temporary or one-time rise in price level is not considered to be inflation. Definitions of inflation. One of the definition is given by Gardner-Eckley. So according to Gardner-Eckley, inflation is a persistent and appreciable rise. That means persistent means continuous, and appreciable rise, that is continuous increase in the general price level. Further, the next definition is given by Pigou. According to Pigou, inflation is when income, that is when money income is expanding, that is when money income is increasing more than in proportion to income earning activity. This means that people are having more income in their hands, and but the goods and services are less in the economy. This creates inflation. So when people have more money to spend, but goods or any commodities are not available in the market, that is there is less of supply, creating inflationary situation. The next definition of inflation is given by Friedman. According to Friedman, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. That means inflation can be produced only by a more rapid increase in the quantity of money than in the output levels, rather than the goods and services which are not supplied. The next definition is given by Colburn. Colburn defines inflation as inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. So there is more money in the economy than the goods. One of the important definition of inflation is given by Crowther. Crowther has defined inflation as inflation is a state in which the value of money is falling. That means the prices are rising. And last definition is given by Paul Samuelson. He has defined inflation as a rise in the general level of prices. Measurement of inflation. A very well-known indicator for inflation is CPI, that is Consumer Price Index. Inflation can be measured using Consumer Price Index. So what is Consumer Price Index? Consumer Price Index is the percentage change in this index over a period of time which gives the amount of inflation over that specific period. That means that is the increase in prices of a representative basket of goods consumed. That means how the prices of a particular goods are changing if we are comparing of certain years. That is CPI. Causes of inflation. There are broadly two causes of inflation. One is demand pull inflation and second is cost push inflation. Let's understand each of these two in much detail. Meaning of demand pull inflation. Demand pull inflation takes place in the situation where there is too much money in the economy, while on the other hand, there are too few goods and services available. Further, in this kind of inflation, that is demand pull inflation, the demand of goods and services is full and it is above the capacity of the economy, so as to produce goods and services in a given time period. So this means that people's demand for goods and services is too much, while at the same time the production is too less within that time period, thus resulting in demand pull inflation. Another meaning is that the demand pull inflation occurs when there is excess of demand over the supply of goods and services. So there is excess of demand while supply of goods and services is very less. Causes of inflation. The first cause of inflation is demand pull inflation. Now we have already understood what is demand pull inflation. Now let's understand what are the important factors that causes demand pull inflation. The first important factor is increase in money supply. Now this takes place when the monetary authorities like RBI decide to pump in more money in the economy. When it supplies more money in the economy than the supply of goods and services that is available, then it results in excess of demand for the goods and services by the people. When there is excess demand over the goods availability, obviously it results in increased price level, thus resulting in demand pull inflation. The second factor creating demand pull inflation is deficit finance. Now usually when there is excess of government expenditure over revenue, that is when the government spends more than it receives, this results in deficit. So the government fills this deficit by engaging in deficit finance. So deficit finance means printing of new currency. Now when the monetary authorities print new currency, it results in increase in the money supply in the economy. Deficit financing, if it is undertaken for unproductive government expenditure, then it results in inflationary situation. Unproductive expenditure means expenditure incurred by the government which does not create or does not bring any income or return back to the government. For example, defense, expenditure spent on maintaining law and order, all this is included in unproductive expenditure. Next factor is credit creation. Commercial banks increase the quantity of money in circulation in the economy when they advance loans. This takes place through credit creation. So credit creation also results in inflationary situation. Next point is exports. Increased exports also leads to inflationary situation. Now whenever the export increases, the earnings of the exporters after they sell their products in the export market, that also increases. Increased earning leads to their increase in the purchasing power. That is, they like to buy more and more goods and services. So thus, the demand for goods and services also increases, thus further leading to a rise in the prices. On the other hand, the increased export also reduces the availability of goods and services in the domestic market, further leading to increased prices and inflationary situation. The fifth factor contributing to demand pull inflation is repayment of public debt. Now today, in the modern world, it is not possible for the government to meet all its expenses through tax and non-tax revenue. So the public revenue falls short while public expenditure is more, and therefore the government incurs public debt. Public debt means loans borrowed by the government from the public. So whenever the government repays this loan, people will have more income in their hands. So when people have more income, it increases their demand for goods and services, thus resulting in demand pull inflation. The next factor contributing to inflation is black money. Now usually the black money is generated from the people who have evaded their taxes, that is, who have not paid their taxes, or if people are engaged in black marketing or any other illegal activities like smuggling and many more. So black money in the hands of tax evaders, smugglers, black marketers results in lavish spending. This causes excess of demand, resulting in increased prices and inflationary situation. The last factor contributing to demand pull inflation is the increased population. Of course, the size of the population is one of the most important determinant of demand. A rapidly growing population puts a great pressure on demand in the economy. This results in increased production and increased demand for goods and services. Thus, this causes a high rise in the prices in an overpopulated country, causing an inflationary situation. This is the diagram showing demand pull inflation. Let's understand this diagram. Now let's understand the diagram of demand pull inflation. On the x-axis we have the level of output, while on the y-axis we have plotted price level. Now in the diagram there are 5 aggregate demand curves which is represented as D1, D2, D3, D4 and D5. While there is one aggregate supply curve that you can see in the diagram as I am pointing it out. So further, in the diagram, YF shows the full employment level of output. So as you can see in the diagram, all the aggregate demand curves, that is D1, D2, D3, D4 and D5 are downward sloping. These aggregate demand curves show the total quantity of spending that takes place at different levels of prices. Further, the aggregate supply curve initially starts sloping upwards to the right, but once it reaches the full employment point, that is YF, the shape of the aggregate supply curve becomes vertical, that is straight line. So this vertical shape of the AS curve indicates perfectly inelastic supply due to full employment. Perfectly inelastic supply means whatever may be the price, the quantity supplied of a particular good would remain the same at any level of price. Further, let's understand this diagram. Now, if the demand shifts, so if the aggregate demand curve shifts from D1 to D2, further to D3, D4 and D5, at the same time it causes the price also to increase as well as the output level also to increase. But this increase in output level will take place only till the full employment point, that is YF, is reached. So beyond the equilibrium point E4, the equilibrium point E4 shows the intersection of the aggregate demand curve D4 and the aggregate supply curve. So beyond E4, if the demand increases further, it will cause the price to rise from P4 to P5. But on the other hand, the supply, that is the output, will not increase because the economy has already reached the full employment point, that is Y4. So as you can see in the diagram, only the price is increasing from P4 to P5 and thus equilibrium point is shifting from E4 to E5, but it is taking place at the same output level, that is YF, thus changing the shape of the supply curve to vertical. So thus the inflation in this way is called as the post full employment phenomenon. Cost push inflation. Many a times economists have said that inflation takes place not always because of excess of aggregate demand, but also because of increase in the cost of production. So the factors of production try to increase their share of the total product by raising their prices. So thus, when the rise in price is due to increased factor costs, this rise in price is called as cost push inflation. So increase in the prices of inputs like labor, increase in profit margin by the business firms, push up the prices result that affect the supply price. So the same quantity of goods and services or lesser quantity of goods and services is supplied at a higher price due to increase in cost, resulting in cost push inflation. So meaning of cost push inflation is that when increase in price level is solely because of cost push factors, it is called as cost push inflation. Another meaning is when there is a fall in aggregate supply of goods and services because of increased cost of production, it is called as cost push inflation. So hence, burden of higher cost of production is always shifted forward to the consumers in the form of higher prices. Causes of inflation, cost push inflation. Now let's understand some important factors that are responsible for cost push inflation. The very first factor is increase in wages. So an increase in wages leads to an increase in the total cost of production and further leading to a rise in the prices. This is because, as we all are aware, prices are totally based on cost. So it has been said that a rise in wages causing a rise in prices results in inflationary spiral. This is because an increase in prices would further motivate the workers to demand higher wages, causing cost push inflation. The second factor is increase in material costs. Prices of materials used in producing goods also play a very important role in the total cost. So prices of the materials may increase either because of increase in demand for these goods or maybe due to few other factors. When the prices of basic inputs like cement, steel, natural gas, coal, crude oil, etc. increases, the effect is wholly felt on the total cost. So an increase in the prices of these materials, especially the basic inputs, totally alters the cost structure of all the goods and services. Thus, the higher cost of production is then passed on to the consumer in the form of higher price of the product, causing cost push inflation. The third factor causing cost push inflation is increase in profit margin. Now, firms that are operating under monopoly power are also responsible for the prices to increase. Now further, a monopoly firm increases the prices of raw materials, intermediate goods to increase their own profit margins. But when these inputs are used by other firms, so the cost of production of these firms also rises, thus causing cost push inflation. The next factor is other factors. So cost of production also increases when the prices of inputs go up as a result of scarcity of the goods and services. For example, the natural calamities like droughts, floods may also affect the supply of basic raw materials, thus making the overall cost of production increase, resulting in cost push inflation. The next factor contributing to cost push inflation is government policy. The government also contributes to cost push inflation. This takes place by raising the existing level of tax rates. So the government can contribute to cost push inflation by imposing higher indirect taxes such as VAT, excise duties on the raw materials and essential goods, or by increasing the existing tax rates. Thus, the prices results in inflationary pressure on the economy. The next factor contributing to cost push inflation is decline in industrial production. If there are industrial disputes between workers and management, then it results in strikes as well as lockouts. This results in fall in industrial production, resulting in increased prices, thus causing cost push inflation. And the last factor contributing to cost push inflation is high prices of imports. When the prices of important goods like oil and petroleum increases by the oil producing countries, then this effect is felt throughout the economy. So because of this effect, the transport cost increases, further leading to higher cost of production, and finally more increased in the overall prices, causing cost push inflation. This diagram is of cost push inflation. Let's understand this diagram in detail. Now let's understand the diagram of cost push inflation. The x-axis shows the level of output and y-axis shows price level. Here in the diagram we have downward sloping aggregate demand curve. This aggregate demand curve shows the total spending that takes place at different price levels, that is P1, P2 and P3. Apart from this, we also have aggregate supply curve. Aggregate supply curve shows what firms like to produce and sell at different price levels. Aggregate supply curves initially slope upwards to the right, thus showing as the employment increases. But it becomes vertical in shape, that is a straight line, once the full employment point YF is reached. This YF point indicates perfectly inelastic supply because of full employment. Further, in this diagram, the intersection of the aggregate demand curve and the aggregate supply curve takes place at point E1. So point E1 is the point of equilibrium where the downward sloping aggregate demand curve intersects the S1 curve, that is the aggregate supply curve. Point, the price is OP1 and the level of employment is at full employment level, that is OYF. Further, if there is an increase in the cost of production, then it will shift the aggregate supply curve upwards to the left. So thus, an increase in the cost of production will shift the aggregate supply curve S1 to S2 and further to S3. Because of this, the corresponding price levels will also increase, that is from P1 to P2 to P3. On the other hand, the level of output will fall. It will fall from the full employment point OYF to OY2 and finally to OY3. So therefore, it is solely because of the cost push factors that causes the supply curve to shift upwards to the left, further leading to an increase in the prices of goods and services, causing cost push inflation. Let's understand the nature of inflation in a developing economy. The nature of inflation in developing countries is quite different from that which is found in the developed countries. So in advanced countries, inflation begins after the level of full employment is reached. But in developing countries, inflation starts before the level of full employment, that is, unemployment is reached. This is because of lack of perfect elasticity of supply of goods and services. Along with this, combined with few other factors, which results in increased cost of production, further leading to continuous increase in prices in the developing countries. Thus, in developing countries, both demand pull factors as well as cost push factors are responsible for inflation. Let's understand the demand pull factors. The first factor is increase in income. In developing countries, the propensity to consume among people is high. This results in increased consumption. Increased consumption causing more demand and further rise in prices. The second factor is increase in public expenditure. In developing countries, the government is engaged in huge investment expenditure on various developmental programs, as well as investment in heavy industries projects. Because of this, there is increased employment and increased income. This further results in increased public expenditure, leading to increased demand for consumption goods, causing the prices of commodities to rise and finally leading to inflationary situation. The third point is gestation period. Gestation period means the time between your investment and before the production actual starts. That is called as gestation period. So in developing countries, due to long gestation period that is involved in all the developmental projects, the income and expenditure increases continuously. This results in decreased output, which further leads to inflationary pressure. The next demand pull factor causing inflation is increased population. As we all are aware that in developing countries, the rate of population growth is very high. This leads to increased aggregate demand, further leading to high prices in an overpopulated countries like India, causing inflationary situation. The next factor is unproductive expenditure. Resources are usually wasted when huge amounts are spent where it is not necessary. For example, in public administration or expenditure on social, religious, political reasons. So all this results in wasteful expenditure with without any good and useful use of goods and services, resulting in inflationary situation. And the last factor is foreign aid. Developing countries mostly depend on foreign aid for implementation of their various developmental projects. So when this foreign aid comes into the domestic economy, suddenly there is an increase in the supply of money, causing an inflationary situation. Some of the cost push factors are, the very first one is inelastic supply. Inelastic supply means when the price of a good falls by 15% and if its supply reduces by 3%, then this is called as inelastic supply. So when the supply of goods and services do not respond to the consumer's increased demand, low capital, outdated technology, then this results in cost push inflation. The next one is backward agricultural sector. Now today, though agriculture in our country or any other developing country is undergoing transformation, but it is still in some or the other way backward. For example, today in our country, there are many farmers like small and marginal farmers who are still dependent on rainfall for their farming. This affects their production level of various crops. Thus, they are not able to respond to a high demand from the market, resulting in inflationary situation. The third factor is supply shocks. The next factor is supply shocks. Most of the developing countries depend on quite a few goods, that is imports from developed countries for their capital requirements, raw materials and other intermediate goods. One such example is of petrol. So increase in input prices can make the supply of a particular good costlier, thus resulting in inflation. The next point is markets imperfections. Now in developing countries, markets are imperfect in ways like there is price rigidity, we ignore market conditions, there is lack of specialization in production, there is not proper training that is given in developing countries. All these factors do not allow for optimum utilization of resources. This further reduces the production level as well as the supply of goods, thus raising their prices, resulting in inflationary situations. The next factor is changes in exchange rate. In order to promote exports and earn more of foreign exchange, developing countries encourage depreciation of their currencies or devaluation of the currencies. This makes imports costlier. The sixth point is increase in wages. Now, because of increased price level, laborers also demand higher wages through their trade unions. This demand of higher wages leads to further increase in prices. Increase in wages leads to increase in prices, which again demands for more wages, resulting in wage push inflation. The next point is infrastructural problems. Now, if in a developing country there is poor infrastructure facilities like roads, transport, communication, irrigation, then this reduces the production level as well as the supply. Further, the cost of production increases due to higher cost for these services. The next factor is inefficient public sectors. In developing countries, government play a very important and an active role in promotion of development, which takes place through PSUs, that is public sector undertakings. But it is always seen most of the time that these public sector units do not perform very efficiently and smoothly. This results in their poor performance and heavy losses. One such example of this is Air India. The last point is inefficient and dishonest administration. Though this problem is a universal problem which is seen in the entire world, but this problem is aggravated in developing countries. So corruption that exists in our country increases the overall cost of production, thus causing inflationary situation. Thus, due to all these problems, many of the developing countries experience a double-digit inflation. The next subtopic is measures to control inflation. Though all economists have always said that certain level of inflation is acceptable in every economy. But if in an economy the inflation is rising rapidly, then it demands control. Therefore, this kind of inflation needs to be controlled at appropriate levels. An uncontrolled inflation will result in the situation of hyperinflation. Therefore, control of inflation requires a combination of monetary, fiscal as well as few other measures. Let's understand all these measures in detail. There are three broad measures to control inflation. The very first one is direct measures. Direct measures are sometimes also called as administrative measures. The second measure is fiscal measure and the third one is monetary measures. Let's understand these three broad measures in detail. Some of the direct measures, also called as administrative measures to control inflation, are as follows. The very first one is price control. The government tries to control prices, especially of the essential commodities which is required for daily consumption. Second is PDS. PDS is public distribution system. So government tries to supply all the essential consumer goods through PDS. So government uses rationing as well as fair price shops. These are the few channels through which the PDS is operating. The third measure is imports of essential goods. Sometimes government also imports essential goods if it is required for daily consumption. For example, petrol. This helps the government to maintain the supply as well as reduce inflation. The next factor is increase in supply. Now, if the inflation is because of shortage of goods and services, then controlling the demand through various measures will not help us. Therefore, the solution is in increasing the supply of goods and services. Now, so the long run solution is to increase production by creating a good productive environment. So this involves improving infrastructure facilities, using good and latest technological resources, providing subsidies, incentives to the industries. All these measures will result in higher level of production, thus controlling the inflationary situation. The next factor is controlling wages, bonus as well as profits. Now the government or the companies can help in reducing inflation by reducing the level of wages, profits and bonuses. Such controls helps in reducing the income of the people, and if the income of the people reduces, they will demand less goods and services. This helps in bringing down the inflationary situations. The last point is indexation. As we all are aware, inflation affects all sections of people. So among these different sections of people, it is usually the wage earners and salary earners as well as other fixed income groups who are affected the most. Therefore, to compensate against this inflation, a method of indexation of income is introduced. So according to this method, or indexation means payment received by the fixed income groups can be increased to the extent of rate of inflation. This is done so that their real income remains the same. So in India, the practice of periodically increasing the income is one of the methods of compensation against the increasing inflationary situation in our country. The second measure to control inflation is monetary measures. Monetary measures are the measures which are adopted by RBI so as to reduce income and to control inflation. So under monetary measures, the first is bank rate. Bank rate is the rate of interest at which RBI provides loan to commercial banks. So during inflation, RBI increases the bank rate. The commercial bank will charge a higher rate of interest on consumer loans, and because of this the borrowing becomes expensive, it becomes costly. This discourages borrowings by the businessmen and the consumers. Thus the volume of money in circulation in the economy will be reduced, thus reducing inflation. The second point is varying reserve ratio. Now these varying reserve ratio are of two types. One is CRR, that is cash reserve ratio, and second is SLR, that is statutory liquidity ratio. So CRR means the commercial banks have to keep certain percentage of their deposits in the form of cash reserve with the RBI. This is the meaning of CRR. While SLR means statutory liquidity ratio. So it is the money that the commercial banks need to preserve in the form of cash, gold, and much more. So when there is inflation, RBI will simply increase CRR and SLR. This will reduce the lending capacity of the commercial banks, thus reducing the inflation. The third point is open market operation. Open market operation means buying and selling of government securities and bills by the RBI. Now this is done so as to control the volume of credit, level of credit. Whenever there is inflation, RBI sells bills and securities to the public or commercial banks, and this is how it takes away cash from them. Thus, this reduces the level of money in circulation and thus controlling the increased prices and thereby controlling inflationary situation. The fourth factor under monetary measures is issue of new currency. So in the economy, whenever there is hyperinflation, RBI will issue new currency in exchange for old currency notes. So thus, due to this step, the volume of money in circulation in the economy falls, thus resulting in fall in the prices and controlling the inflationary situation. The last factor under monetary measure is demonetization of currency. In order to control inflation, RBI may also take this extreme step of demonetization of currency. This takes place for higher denominations. So the denomination or demonetization is expected to leave a negative impact on inflation, and due to demonetization, consumer spending also falls. This activity of demonetization was done by the Narendra Modi government on 8th of November 2016, which had announced the demonetization of all rupees 500 and rupees 1000 banknotes. Also, it was announced that this step was basically taken in order to reduce the illegal cash or black money in the economy. The third type of measure to control inflation is fiscal measures. Monetary measures alone cannot be very effective to control inflation. Therefore, an effective strategy will be to control inflation by using a combination of fiscal along with monetary measures. So fiscal measures means measures adopted by the government with respect to taxation, expenditure and borrowings. So government's fiscal policy plays a very important role to control inflation. So here the first important factor under fiscal measure is government expenditure. So first point is government measure. The government should reduce its expenditure, that is spending, in order to control inflation. This can take place by reducing unproductive expenditure. So unproductive expenditure is expenditure done by the government on defense, maintaining law and order, providing interest payments, administrative expenses and so on. So when government unproductive expenditure is reduced, the aggregate demand related to limited supply of goods and services will also be reduced, thus reducing inflation. The second factor is taxation. Government can increase taxes in order to reduce the inflationary situation. So when more taxes are imposed by the government, the amount of money in the hands of public will be reduced. Once the income in the hands of public is reduced, this will reduce their consumption, thus reducing the demand on goods and services and thereby bringing down the prices. So during inflation, new taxes should be adopted by the government, or the existing tax rates must be increased by the government in order to reduce inflation. Another factor is savings. Government, through its various policies, should promote a habit of savings among people. So strong savings or increased savings will reduce the people's tendency to consume and spend without necessarily having any harmful effect on taxation. This will overall reduce the inflation level. The last factor under fiscal measure is public debt or public borrowing. During inflation, government should adopt, and it should rather avoid paying back any of its past loans which it had taken in order to prevent any increase in the circulation of money in the economy. On the other hand, during inflation, public borrowing should be increased, as this will take away excess of money from the hands of public and thus reducing their spending capacity, thereby reducing inflation. Thus, to the end, I would like to say that control of inflation is required, and this should be attempted before the inflation crosses its acceptable limit. Attempts to control inflation cannot take place by using any one particular type of measure, but rather it depends on how successful the government uses a combination of all the different three types of measures is important. Success of the measures to control inflation depends on effective implementation that requires efficient and honest administration system. Effects of inflation. Inflation has social, economic, and political consequences. There are different effects of inflation that is felt in the economy. These are effects of inflation on production, on distribution, on consumption and welfare, few other economic effects, as well as social and political consequences of inflation. Let's understand each of these categories in detail. Effects of inflation. The effects of inflation can be categorized into two main broad categories. First is economic effects of inflation, and second is social and political effects of inflation. Let's understand about the first category, that is economic effects of inflation. The effects of inflation on the economic system can be further classified into three categories. One is effects of inflation on production. Second is effects of inflation on distribution, consumption and welfare, and few other economic effects. Let's start with the economic effects of inflation on production. The effect of inflation on production is further classified into two categories. One is the stimulating effect and second is the disastrous effect. Let's start with the stimulating effect. According to Keynes, a moderate rise in prices, which is called as mild inflation, will have a beneficial effect on production. This will only take place when there is unutilized resources in an economy. When prices rise, profit increases because the price level rises at a much faster rate than the cost of production. Thus, the businessmen are motivated to invest more, and because of this, employment, output, and income increases. But there is a limit to this. This limit is the limit of full employment. Once the full employment point is reached in the economy, so even if the prices rise further, it will not benefit or it will not result in further increase in production, employment, and real income. Therefore, till the level of full employment is reached, moderately rising prices will be beneficial. So, the benefit effect of production is possible only when inflation does not take place at a too faster rate, which in technical terms is called as running inflation. The next effect is the disastrous effect of inflation. The disastrous effect of inflation on the economic system can be classified into following factors. The first one is maladjustments. Inflation leads to maladjustments in production. It affects the working of the price system, which is disastrous for the entire economic system. Next is speculation. During inflation, the business economy or the business community is concentrated or it is motivated more for doing activities which is involved in speculating. This is done so as to make quick profits rather than concentrating more on genuine productive capacity. Third factor is hoarding and black marketing. During inflation, when prices are rising rapidly, there is hoarding of large stock of goods, which becomes very profitable. Hoarding is encouraged, which further reduces the supply of goods in the economy. Thus, the next phenomena that comes in is the black marketing, which develops. The next point is seller's market. Inflation tends to create a seller's market. So as a result of this, sellers have a total command on prices. Why? Because of excessive demand in the market. Sellers do not care for the quality of the goods. Their interest is only in maximization of profits. The next and the last factor in the disastrous effect includes resource allocation. Inflation will turn resource allocation away from longer term productive investments to unproductive assets like investing in housing, real estate, gold, and much more. So such a diversification of savings affects or rather reduce the future capacity of the economy to grow. Effects of inflation on distribution. Inflation redistributes income because prices of all factors do not rise in the same proportion. During inflation, all producers, traders, and speculators gain. So the first factor that affects the inflation on distribution is the debtors and creditors. Debtors generally gain and creditors lose during an inflation. The debtor gain as a result of inflation because he repays loans at a time when the purchasing power of money is lower than when it was borrowed. On the other hand, the creditor is a loser during inflation. This is because he receives less in goods and services than he would have received in times of low prices. Thus, borrowers who borrowed funds before inflation gain during inflation, and creditors who lend funds lose. Next point is about business community. Inflation is always welcomed by entrepreneurs and businessmen. This is because they get profit due to rising prices. Also, they find that prices are rising faster than the cost of production, so that their profit margin increases. So therefore, the business community gets supernormal profits during periods of inflation. And those profits continues to increase as long as prices are rising. The next factor is about fixed income groups. Inflation hits wage earners and salaried people very hard. Since wages do not rise at the same rate and at the same time as general price level. So those who depend exclusively on their fixed salaries for their living are severely affected due to inflation. So among these people are clerks, government servants, pensioners, and so on. Next factor is investors. Those who invest in debentures and fixed interest bearing securities, bonds, they lose during inflation. However, investors in equities benefit during inflation. The last factor is about farmers. Farmers usually gain during inflation. This is because they can get better prices for their harvest during inflation. So thus, we can say that inflation redistributes income and wealth in favor of businessmen, debtors, and farmers, but it severely hits consumers, small investors, people in the labor class, middle class, and fixed income groups very hard. The next economic effects of inflation is felt on consumption and welfare. So inflation also affects the consumer's value of money. It affects their purchasing power. The real consumption of the common people decline. So rising cost of living during inflation means falling standard of living and thus falling the economic welfare of the people at large. The other effects of inflation are as follows. The first factor is deterioration in savings. Continuous inflation reduces the savings of the people in the long run. Savers are adversely affected when the rate of inflation is more than the current rate of interest. During inflation, the rates of interest falls. The capacity to save is also reduced because of increase in cost of living and as well as increase in the spending capacity of the people due to increased prices. So continuous rise in inflation discourages individuals' savings. The second factor is disturbance in planning. Government's planned programs as well as allocation of resources are disturbed because of resource constraints as well as due to rise in factor costs. Investment allocation is based on the current price level that takes place and it is calculated at the beginning of the planning process. This planning is largely affected in the later years of the plan, thus creating resource constraint and affects the fulfillment of the plans that were previously made. The last factor is lowering of international competitiveness. If the rate of inflation in an economy is higher than in other countries, the country's international competitiveness in foreign market is weakened. The next effect of inflation is felt on social and political environment. A continuous inflation in a country affects the social and political environment. Inflation redistributes income and wealth in the favor of rich, thus widening this gap of inequality and increasing social injustice. A continuous rise in inflation results in social unrest in the form of strikes, lockouts, corruption, black marketing, smuggling, and much more. The government finds it increasingly difficult to maintain law and order. So thus, inflation affects every section of the society. So according to economists, mild inflation levels do have a favorable effect on the economy. But if the inflation levels rise above the mild level, then it needs to be immediately addressed.